Hello and welcome back to Film on High Reviews. This is Alex.
This is Decca.
And today we're going to be talking about the 1986 film Stand By Me, directed by Rob Reiner, starring Will Wheaton, River Phoenix, Corey Feldman, and Jerry O'Connell. The film, an adaptation of the novel of The Body written by Stephen King, tells a story of four boys on the cusp of adolescence living in a small town in Oregon who, by chance, stumble across some information that may lead to the body of a young boy from their community who has gone missing, decide to pack up and head on an adventure together to discover the body, thinking that they may gain credit and fame for being the ones who solve the mystery. Along the way, they face adversity and strife that ultimately leads them to having profound realizations about themselves and the world around them. So, what did you think of Stand By Me?
What a great film. Like a little time capsule of just when you were a kid and whether or not you had adventures like this, but you'd remember something like this that would always stick by you. And the way that these actors, the whole ensemble of the film just portrays it so well that you kind of put yourself in one of their characters and you kind of go along with the adventure and you start to question things that you went through in your own childhood. It just evokes so many emotions that it's very hard to pinpoint exactly how I feel about it, but I know that this is what you call a great film that has an actual message, but it doesn't hammer it onto yourself. It's just there for you to enjoy it and for you to kind of leave it with a clear thought of, man, those were the days.
Yeah, this is a wonderful little movie, great coming-of-age film, and a bit of an unexpected surprise, I think, for a lot of people. Because a lot of people coming to the film, I think they're sort of surprised when they discover that it's based on a Stephen King story, because of course Stephen King is known for making horror and stories like that. This film is not so much a horror story, although there are definitely some horrific and morbid elements in there. Specifically, the whole central conceit of the movie being about these four boys who are going to find a dead body. That's a pretty disturbing idea. And it also kind of deals with these boys and their backstories, their traumas, like dealing with the loss of family members, grief, parental neglect, parental abuse in some cases. But it's really more about that kind of carefree, innocent time of, youth and friendship. And it's framed from the point of view of an older man looking back on his childhood. And that's kind of a device that's used in the original story as well. In the original story, it's a bit more pronounced because it's very clear that this is like a writer writing a story about something that happened to him when he was young. We sort of have that idea in the film as well, but it's minimized and it's used more with like this writer character, the older version of Gordy, the character played by Will Wheaton. His narration is kind of used to push the movie along and stuff like that. And so it has that sense of nostalgia. And even though it's set in like the 1950s, very kind of specific time period where I guess you could say like a simpler time in some ways, like the whole concept of the movie about, these boys going off for like a 2-day trip and their parents not, freaking out and wondering where they went. Like, again, it seems like some of those ideas might seem a bit antiquated in relation to today, but the movie still has that timeless quality of capturing that, that period in your life where there's so much to discover and the whole world is kind of ahead of you and you're in that stage of transition where you're still kind of a child, but you're moving into like teenage years basically. And, it's confusing and it's kind of frightening and it's all of these things and, how much your friends mean to you and you form these little groups and that becomes kind of like your identity in a way. The movie does a really good job at capturing that and these four characters with their sort of distinct personality. We have Gordy, played by Will Wheaton, who's kind of the more dreamer, sensitive one. He's the artistic one, the writer, and we find out that his older brother Denny recently died in a fairly traumatic accident, and this is something that had a very shattering impact on his family. His parents can't cope with the loss, and as a result, he undergoes a significant amount of neglect in addition to his own grief regarding the loss of his older brother. And we have Chris Chambers, played by River Phoenix, who's Gordy's best friend and kind of the leader, tough kid of the gang. He comes from a really bad family, and he has a bad reputation for being like a thief, kind of a thug. And we have Teddy, played by Corey Feldman. He's kind of the more loose cannon of the group, a little bit crazy, but again, we find out that he was kind of a victim of something horrible too, because his father was a veteran of World War II, but he sort of, I guess, had some sort of profound mental trauma or PTSD, and he did something really horrible to Teddy where he pushed his head up against a stove and like partially burned off his ear. In the movie, it's only one ear, but in the original story, it's worse because he burned like both of his ears, if I remember correctly. And lastly, we have Vern, played by Jerry O'Connell. Vern is kind of like the more wimpy kid, the scaredy cat, kind of chubby and soft, compared to the others, but he's a bit more of like the goofball, I guess you could say, like comic relief. And Vern, interestingly enough, is the one who sort of originates this whole plan, because he happens to overhear this, basically his older brother and a friend of his, they were out in the country in a stolen car, joyriding basically, and they stumbled upon this kid's body, Ray Brower, who's a local kid from their town. Mm-hmm. He disappeared when he was on like he just went out for like a trip, a walk or whatever, and never came back, so he's still listed as missing. And Vern's older brother and his buddy actually saw the body, but they're terrified of reporting it because they were there in a stolen car, so they think it's going to lead to consequences to them. So Vern hears about this, and he, kind of quickly brings the information back to his other friends, and they all decide to go out on this trip. And that's like, I love that kind of device, like the whole idea of framing it as like, because it's very Stephen King-ish. Like, in a way, you have this, it's kind of like a classic, like, boys' adventure story. You got the four boys heading out into the wilderness, like, having this adventure, but it's got those darker undertones, like, the whole idea of we're going to find a dead body, and there are some, like, kind of messed up things that happen along the way, too, like, so it definitely has that kind of Stephen King flavor, but a little bit lighter, you could say, than some of his other work. Yeah, like, it's used in a different kind of way, like, but it definitely has, like, some of those identifiable markers, I guess you could say. But in this story, it's really more about these character dynamics and the interactions we have between Gordy, Chris, Teddy, and Vern. And this was something that was so beautifully illustrated in the story as well, and the movie captures that amazingly, not just through the script and the direction, but also the performances of these four young actors, who are all exceptional here. Like, maybe some of the best acting you'll ever see from, like, child actors. Really able, like, particularly, I guess you could say, like, really all of them, but, a lot of people tend to emphasize River Phoenix's performance, but they all do some pretty good work, some good, like, emotional stuff, and just those kind of bonds, that camaraderie that they have with each other, it feels real, and that is what really makes the movie work.
One thing this movie does extremely well is the cinematography, the landscapes, the locations that they have. They make it feel how you would have felt back in those days, because, again, using the device of, this is back in the 1950s, this is before cell phones, distractions, and all that type of stuff. Just four boys, as you mentioned, just hanging out into nature, facing off dangers, especially at night, where, there could be coyotes, wolves, and all they have as protection is a gun and a fire. And so putting them into that landscape, it just makes you feel like, that longing of just having a nice conversation without anything like someone beeping or something like that, or like videos to watch. It's just four boys just, messing around with each other. Sometimes, yes, they get into fights, but they have this cool system called Skin It, where it's just basically like, okay, look, pat on the shoulder, bygones be bygones type of thing. And it's nice because every type of friendship usually has those types of things of like, okay, there's certain lines we won't cross, and we'll just back each other up. And that's the most important part, is that each and every one of them backs each other whenever they come in peril. Like, there's a couple of situations that come in mind. One of them is, Gordy running from the dog, and Teddy just kind of like rambling on to this mechanic. He's kind of like, the scary dude. And then he mentions something about his father, and it throws Teddy into this boiling rage. But you see all the friends just being there, kind of like supportive of him, knowing that he went through something that he does not want to think about. As you mentioned, it was horrible what happened to his ear, but he still reveres his dad as like being a hero. And that's something that not a lot of people can do in terms of writing, of like that complexity of someone hurting you, but you still see them as an idol, because it's not just their parent, but this person, like they mentioned, he's a veteran of World War II, so with the PTSD, all that type of stuff, you look past that and you're like, dang, it's just, you don't know exactly how to place it. This guy is horrible, but he thought of something horrible. So in our day and age, we can understand it. And that's the other great part. Watching it as an adult here now, as being 33, this hits a lot harder for me than if I would have watched it when I was in my 20s, because now I've lived life, I've lost people and shit, so it kind of like puts things in perspective of just like, holy crap, like the passage of time is a weird thing. And for the writer, the actual guy narrating it, looking back into his life, especially with the end where he explains where everybody ended up, it's just, that's where it hurts the most, because you're just there kind of like, man, what about some of the friends that I haven't kept in touch with? Like, it makes you feel those emotions.
Yeah, the movie almost has that feeling of like the look back at the idyllic kind of, youthful summer. And it has that kind of nostalgic hue and feeling to it, but there are those kind of, those dark undercurrents and those Stephen King type elements. Like The Gun's a really good example, where you have these kids setting out, and Chris takes his father's .45 automatic pistol with them. And, like, it's kind of this thing where it's like, oh, now they have a gun. And it's like this kind of thing that creates this lingering tension in the story where, they have this gun, and eventually it's going to come into play in the story somehow. So it has those, like those recognizable elements. But yeah, it focuses on, there's a complexity to it with like the kids and their different sort of situations. Like, the movie kind of goes a bit less into detail about it. The book gives a bit more detail, but yeah, particularly like the fathers, like the father character never really appear in the story proper, with the exception of Gordy's dad, who we see a few times. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we hear about Teddy's dad and how he did this to him, and kind of now his father has been declared like he's been declared mentally incompetent, and he's in a mental institution. And again, that's something that Teddy struggles with. Like, yeah, even though his father abused him and did this, mutilated him essentially, he still does revere his father, and he can't stand to have his father sort of denigrated. And there's like a contrast with Gordy, who, he doesn't understand how Teddy cares that much about his dad after doing something like that to him. Mm-hmm. Because, Gordy he doesn't care that much about his own father, because his father's very distant from him, and you have Chris's dad, who is mentioned to be this kind of abusive, alcoholic, violent. So again, these kind of things that inform the story and inform the different characters. And yeah, like there's a rich level of like depth here in terms of their relationships. Like, the story is relatively simple. It kind of hits those beats of like, the boys on the adventure, and there's moments of like, the realization, the disillusionment, like the scene where they go to the junkyard. That's a good example, where they hear about like this junkyard owner and his big evil dog named Chopper, who's been trained to like sick their balls and rip off their balls and stuff like that. Yeah. So they've really built up this kind of like local legend and mythology. But then when they actually see Chopper, he's just like a regular dog. He's not even particularly fearsome. Mm. So there's kind of like, that the coming to terms the first time with, the difference between real life and exaggeration and myth. and then giving way to much darker things like dealing with death, with mortality, like the whole idea of finding the dead kid, like that's like at first, like, they it seems almost like something larger than life, like something out of a comic book or a movie. But then as they go deeper on this adventure, it starts to become realer for them, and it becomes this, particularly for Gordy, like he mentions that it almost becomes this obsession where even as they go through like these pretty messed up situations, like, they have a close call with the junkyard owner, and then they're crossing a railroad trestle, and Gordy and Vern come very close to almost getting hit by a train. Mm-hmm. And later on, there's another disturbing episode that involves some leeches. Oh, yes. So yeah, they go through these pretty like messed up things, but there's that drive to just continue and get to like the end of the adventure. But their journey is eventually complicated by another group of characters, the older boys, who, like I mentioned earlier, Vern's brother Billy, who he heard this from originally. They're part of this little gang of kind of hoodlums led by a guy named Ace Merrill, who's kind of this, kind of bully scumbag, like not a nice guy. He's played by Kiefer Sutherland in the movie, and Kiefer does a good job at playing this kind of, asshole bully type of guy. Yeah. So yeah, Ace is kind of like, the big tough dude. He's got this whole gang of guys, and Billy and his buddy who found the body originally, they're very fearful of him, and like we see throughout the movie, there's occasional scenes where we cut to their gang, and eventually it gets to a point where Billy and his buddy Charlie, they can't keep it a secret anymore, and they eventually spill the truth to Ace and everybody else in their gang. And what do you know? They get the very same idea that our four young heroes have and decide to go out there, claim the body, and, reap the benefits, be famous, all that kind of stuff. The whole notion of we'll be famous for finding a dead body seems a bit silly nowadays, although back then, this was in the 50s where, it was small town, like, something like that would make the news. So it probably wouldn't get them on, like, international news, but it would be enough to get them enough attention, like... We see people do like way more stupid stuff for attention in today's social media age. So, So yeah, now you have these older boys who are also going out there to find the body. So it leads to kind of an inevitable confrontation between these two groups. And that works really well as like kind of a building. Like we've had this whole adventure with these boys. And, like all these different little things that happened. Like almost these little episodes, like I mentioned, of things they have to go through. And Ace and his gang sort of represent the final challenge. They arrive, they find the body. And, once they actually see the body up close, that's another kind of disillusionment moment. Like a moment where it becomes really real. Gordy, in particular, is really affected by it because, he's still grieving over his older brother's death and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So they find this body, and they're finally, it's their big moment, but it's not as glorious as they thought it would be. And just as they're about to, head back, that's when Ace and his gang show up, and you have that kind of final showdown. And it's interesting in the movie. In the book, it's a bit different. Like, they have this confrontation, and they stand up to Ace. Ace basically tells them, we're going to take the body. If you stand up to us, we're just going to beat you up and take it anyway. There's nothing you can do. But they stand up to them because, they've come this far, and, this is their body. They've done this. This is their whole adventure. Like, Ace and his gang, they just drove out there in their cars. They didn't have to go through all the stuff they had to go through. So there's a sense of, like, pride and, like, ownership almost of, like, we're going to make our stand here. But then Ace, he pulls out his knife, and now things look like they're about to get really serious. So then Gordy pulls out the gun, fires it, and, now he's the one in control. And he kind of drives Ace and his gang back and threatens them. And, Ace kind of toys with him. He's like, you're not man enough to shoot me. But Gordy makes, Gordy is threatening enough, like he stands up to him and he convinces him, like, no, I am going to blow you away if you try to mess with me. So he sort of diffuses the situation. In the book, it's a little bit different because Chris is actually the one who pulls out the gun. And in the book, maybe it makes a bit more sense because Chris is kind of the more hero figure. But in the movie, like, in terms of Gordy's whole main character journey, I guess they felt like it made more sense to have him be the one who makes the stand.
I like the real close friendship with Chris and Gordy because within a group, there's always the people that are like closer to each other, while other people they're just like friends and just stuff like that. But with those two, you get to really see the things that they've gone through, the way that they talk about it, and the way they very much support each other. There's like this really nice scene during when they're camping outside and it's nighttime, so they decide to stand watch because they don't know what's out there. They hear a bunch of coyotes, like I mentioned, and we get a scene with Chris and Gordy where Chris kind of explains some of the shit that he's gone through, and it's the slow kind of breaking down in front of your friend, showing all the emotions, and showing like yeah, boys cry sometimes because some shit we just can't hold on to, and like it's good to see that he was able to confide in him, and we get to reverse of that as you mentioned when Gordy looks at the body and he breaks down and stuff, and it's just getting to see that where again they back up each other, and they did it in a very real way where it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like it came off a script. It came like as if there was just a cameraman documenting the whole thing instead of an actual movie going on. That's how it almost real the movie felt, and just having that was poignant. But needless to say that even the side characters with Teddy and Vern, they still get their moments to shine in a way where they get to show who they really are, and that's what's cool about them. Is that yes, Vern can be a coward, but when it comes up to it, sometimes he might fight back, sometimes he might like scream back or anything like that. But you look at Teddy, and yeah, he's a loose cannon, but throughout the film, he has this kind of little arc where he gets a little bit more chilled out. And yes, he's still the smart ass, he's still the smart mouth, but he's when they're doing the confrontation, he's the one saying to Chris like, okay, look, let's just let them have the body and stuff. And it was just you don't expect really Gordy to stand up to that, and that's where yes, the difference in the ending, with Chris being the hero, it makes more sense. But for the film, it's kind of like his own arc of like just being able to stand up for himself, not being neglected, not being seen. It's just like this is my moment, my time. And these are just the thoughts that I think after watching the movie. When I'm just watching, I'm just like, yes, he's just doing it and standing up for himself, and you just feel this kind of moment of like, yeah, like was there a moment in my life where I stood up and I was like this? It's a feel good moment, even though life in that moment is just kind of like a good lesson of like you did this journey, you went through the hard way, and then somebody just took a shortcut just to steal your glory, and that moment just kind of like, oh fuck, that just fucking sucks. That hit me hard.
Yeah, the four main characters are all pretty remarkable, like really richly drawn relationships. They're fairly relatable in their own way too. Like again, that's something Stephen King does well when he writes about like kids or young characters. It's one of the reasons It was so great. And yeah, like just in terms of that sort of classic coming of age journey of like you have this adventure, and when you're a kid it doesn't seem like much. It just seems like another thing you do, another fun time, but then you reflect on it as an adult and you see that it was like one of those kind of profound defining moments of your life where you sort of changed, where you started looking at the world a different way. Like Stephen King captures that really well in this story, and like it's a movie that made an impression on me. Like I saw the movie when I was really young, like probably around like I don't know 12 years old or something like that. So yeah, like I saw the movie when I was a kid, the same age as the characters in it, and I read the story around that time too. It led me to the story, and like I was writing back then too, sort of developing as a writer, so I related to Gordy's character in a lot of ways. Like the whole scene where they're sitting around the fire and he tells like his story to his friends to entertain them. I used to do stuff like that when I was in high school as well. So I relate to the movie on that sort of basis. But it also has that universal quality of, I think a lot of people can relate to, of just yeah, reflecting on their own childhood, their own friendships, and like the changing, the inevitable changing as you get older, growing apart and those kind of things. And the movie sort of leads to a bit of a, it closes on like a fairly bittersweet note. And, there's a real sense of tragedy to it. Not in like a really overpowering way, but it still hits you and it feels profound. And yeah, like I think it's one of those rare examples of a movie that, even though like from our generation we're pretty far removed from this period, like that, it's not the 50s anymore, the world has changed, but it just captures that sense of timelessness, that sense of something that we can all sort of relate to in our own childhood. And I think that's what makes the movie really resonate and why it's still so well regarded.
There's a lot of stuff I can say about the film, but this is an experience that you should partake into just because, again, whatever stage you are in life, this has something to say to you. And again, just the cinematography, just the landscapes that they chose for this film. Like, where was this shot? I don't know.
It was filmed around Oregon, which is, actually the state that the fictional town of Castle Rock is set in. So,
Yes.
they decided to actually go there and capture those kind of landscapes and that sense of the outdoors. And yeah, like it feels real, like it has that sense of genuine adventure. Like it does like a good job at making you feel like you're there with the boys, and you can sort of relate to that feeling of the adventure out into the outdoors, like especially now where we're living in such a technological age, and that everyone has a goddamn smartphone or whatever. Like there's a certain amount of like appeal to this movie, like again that kind of simpler time. Like obviously we tend to like we mythologize the past, and we look at it, we idealize it, but the movie kind of does a good job at capturing, like I said, that sense of the golden summer of youth. Like we've all had that kind of particular time in our lives, I think, regardless of what time period you may live in, and I think that's where the real appeal of the film lies.
Exactly. And again, this is timeless. This is something that I'd love to revisit again, especially the book format, just to kind of get to really see the whole thing. But I'm just gonna have to give my rating for this 5 out of 5. This stands out.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5 too, because I feel like I kind of have to. Like, it's a film that's really marked my life. It's a film I've watched it a lot. Like, I can almost recite like all the dialogue in the movie. Like, it's a movie that is close to my heart in a lot of ways. And yeah, I would highly recommend it. Like, it might not be everyone's cup of tea. There might be like, the cursing or the kids smoking or some of the stuff in the movie might turn some people off, but I think it's just, yeah, like it has that real sense of timelessness and relatability that few films can really achieve.
So, have you seen the film? What'd you think about it? Have you read the book? Let us know down in the comments down below. Till then, this has been Film on High.
Peace.
Later.